He went on to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard, rented it to some farmers, and went away for a long time. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants so they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, but that one also they beat and treated shamefully and sent away empty-handed. He sent still a third, and they wounded him and threw him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my son whom I love. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they talked the matter over. "This is their heir," they said. "Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to the others. When the people heard this, they said, "God forbid." Jesus looked directly at them and asked, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately, because they knew he had spoken this parable against them. But they were afraid of the people. Keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said, so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So the spies questioned him, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" He saw through their duplicity and said to them, "Show me a denarius whose image and inscription are on it." "Caesar's," they replied. He said to them, "Then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." They were unable to trap him in what he had said there in public, and astonished by his answer, they became silent.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good morning. Hi, my name's Matt, if we've not met. Keep your Bible open or your service sheet to hand. If you're new or you haven't been for a little while, every autumn we work through a chunk of the Gospel of Luke, and that's where we are today. We're in this section of chapter 20. The story so far is that so last year, I don't know if you remember, but Jesus spent 10 chapters traveling, and he's finally arrived in Jerusalem. He's arrived on this collision course that we've been talking about. The Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time, have been opposing him throughout his travels. They've been on this collision course, and he's finally arrived. And he arrives at Passover. So it's this enormously important religious festival. And the city would have been absolutely rammed. Travelers would have been streaming in by the thousands through the gates into Jerusalem. So you've got to imagine it's sort of London Olympics type atmosphere. There's just people everywhere you look. The city doubled, tripled in size during the festival of Passover. And Jesus, a couple of weeks ago now, he arrived with his followers, so with his team of 12, his core team, and with a whole bunch of other followers who, when he arrives, they proclaim him as king. And the first thing that he does on getting to the city is he goes to the temple, the religious center of the city, and he causes a scene. He says, teaching in the temple after throwing some tables around, he says that the religious leaders have been robbing the people. He calls the temple their den. They are the robbers, and they take refuge having robbed the country in their den. And the chief priests, so those are the priests that are in charge of the temple, so they're the sort of top religious people, and they oppose him and they say, "What gives you the authority to say that? And then Jesus tells the parable that we've just had read. And it's absolutely explosive, this parable. Because with this crowd of people listening in, so all his followers are there. You've got to imagine the temple's rammed with people. All his followers are there. These chief priests are there. And Jesus says that historically and presently, the religious leaders oppose God, oppose the prophets that he sends, and oppose his son. He says, these chief priests, historically and right now, they do not have your best interests at heart. And they do not have the interests of God at heart. You know, it's incendiary stuff, isn't it? You've got to imagine that moment. We kind of get a little glimpse of it. If you look back at the chapter, there's this little verse 16. In the Pew Bibles it says, when the people heard this, they said, "May this never be," or "surely not," or "God forbid." As in, the crowd hears the parable and they're like, "Surely not. You don't mean that." Because there's this, imagine the moment when Jesus finishes it and the crowd, they look from Jesus, who's finished this parable, and all the eyes turn from Jesus to the chief priests. It must have been, to be a chief priest in that moment, that would have been a hard room to be in, wouldn't it? Jesus is saying that the chief priests, the religious establishment, they want the resources Israel has for themselves. Earlier in Luke, he says they love money. And so, following that moment, we pick up our reading at verse 19. The teachers of the law and the chief priests looked for a way to arrest him immediately because they knew he had spoken this parable against them, but they were afraid of the people. No kidding, they're afraid of the people. He's just told this parable in which he said they are robbing you and they don't have your best interests at heart, nor do they have the interests of God at heart. There's a whole crowd of them that are proclaiming Jesus as king. You know, previously the priests and the people that have opposed Jesus, they've opposed him because they thought he was a blasphemer, they thought he was breaking some laws. But now Jesus is calling them out. You know, this is now a threat. He's now a threat to them. Previously, he was a lawbreaker. Now he's an existential threat. This is serious for them. They're backed into a corner, and so they have to make a move. Verse 20, keeping a close watch on him, they sent spies who pretended to be sincere. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said, so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So they set a trap, is what they do. They have people watch Jesus as he moves around the city, and they bring in some people to trap Jesus with a question. So last time, obviously, they challenged Jesus, his authority. Jesus called them out, and there was this whole crowd there, and they're in trouble. So now they can't do it out in the open, and so they bring in some people who pretend to be sincere. They fake faith. And they follow Jesus around and ask him a question that will trap him. And they have to choose their question really carefully, don't they? They have to trap him in such a way that either he loses his following or he loses his life. Ideally, the latter. So what's the question? Verse 21. The spies questioned him, Jesus, "Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth." Here it is. Is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Seems like a relatively innocent question, doesn't it? But the context is that Rome has been in power for a few generations by now. So the Roman Empire conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC. And they gave Israel freedom. The Romans let Israel practice their religion as they wanted. But they taxed them extremely heavily. And obviously, the Jews hated that. They hated paying taxes to people that were occupying them. You know, it's like, imagine Russia wins the war in Ukraine, and 10 years down the line, the Ukrainians have to pay taxes to Putin. That's what's going on in their heads. They hate that. And more than that, Caesar, the leader of Rome, proclaimed himself to be the Son of God. That was what Caesar said about himself. So not only are they being taxed really heavily, they're being taxed really heavily by a pagan idolater heretic. And so while it's easy to think of this issue as academic, this question as academic, this is not an academic question for the Jews at the time. And it's definitely not an academic question for Jesus' disciples, is it? You know, think about the 12. Think about the people, Jesus' disciples, the closest people to him. Who is amongst that group listening in when this question is asked? Well, in the list in Luke, they're named, and they include Matthew. Levi becomes Matthew, the tax collector. So he was one of the people whose job it was to collect the taxes from the Jews and give them to the Romans. And often he would skim a bit, or they would skim a bit off the top for themselves. So people hated tax collectors. So in amongst Jesus' disciples is Matthew, listening in when this question is asked. Also, if you read the list in Luke chapter 6, you read that his disciples included someone called Simon. Now, not Simon Peter, who we know lots about, but someone called Simon the Zealot. Now, when you first read that, Simon the Zealot, what that kind of brought to my mind was that this was just a particularly enthusiastic guy. He was like, you know, a white-hot Jesus freak, and so they gave him the nickname Zealot. But actually, that's not what zealot means in this context. The zealots were actually a group. They were a political sort of group of activists. They were hardcore Jewish activists, and they lived in the hills around the cities, and they were basically thugs, sort of pirates. So they would raid Roman caravans and steal Roman stuff. They would assassinate tax collectors and basically cause as much trouble for Romans as they possibly could. That was who the zealots were. And so later on, when Jesus is crucified, he's crucified alongside two robbers, but the word in Greek used for robbers isn't the normal word for robbers, it's the word for bandit, which is sort of another word for zealots. So Jesus is crucified alongside two zealots who were opposing Rome. So you've got to imagine the chief priests, they've worked hard on this question. How can we trap Jesus? What can we say that will trap him? And they ask this question, and in amongst the disciples are people listening in who are both tax collectors on one side and zealots on the other. You know, there must have been some serious counselling between Matthew and Simon the zealot, mustn't there? That would have been a really difficult relationship that Jesus would have had to help them a lot to get along. But anyway, this is the question that they ask. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And I suppose for the disciples, the thing that's underneath that is, Jesus, are you here to take Caesar's throne or not? You know, that's kind of the issue underneath the surface, is we've heard you're a king to bring peace, but does you bringing peace mean that you're going to take Caesar off the throne and sit in it instead? Is that how your kingdom, Jesus, relates to Rome? And so the spies, they come, they ask the question, should we pay taxes to Caesar or not? And now Jesus, he's stuck here, isn't he? He's in the trap, because either way, the chief priests win. So if Jesus says, yes, you should pay taxes, it's like he's aligning himself with Rome, isn't it? And at that point, the Jews think, well, we don't want to follow you. You're telling us to pay taxes to the Romans, who we hate. We hate Caesar. We don't want to follow you if you're aligning yourself with Caesar. But if Jesus says no, then that's even better, because the chief priest can go to Pilate or Herod and say, this Jesus guy, he's inciting a rebellion because he's telling us not to pay taxes to Caesar. You should deal with him. Which, incidentally, is exactly what they say to Pilate when they do put him on trial in chapter 23. They lie. That's exactly what they say. Anyway, so Jesus he's in the trap. Either he says, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, he aligns himself with Rome, and his followers will leave him because they wouldn't want to follow someone that aligns with Rome. Or he says no, the chief priests go to Pilate, Herod, say, take him away, and he will then be crucified as a zealot. You see the trap that he's in. Verse 23, he saw through their duplicity and said to them, show me a denarius. Now, eBay is a weird place. It turns out if you search for denarius on eBay, you can buy one. Here we are. This is one that I bought from a guy called Coinmaster_100. It's a tiny little coin. It's crazy to think that you can buy something that's 2,000 years old on eBay for £8 plus postage. But it may be fake. Obviously, it may be fake, made by some guy in, Slough or wherever. No offense, Slough. But he says, bring me a denarius. So they bring him a denarius, and he looks at it, and he asks, whose image and inscription are on it? Caesar's, they replied. And here's the answer that absolutely floors the chief priests. Here's the answer that basically means that the chief priests can no longer come and oppose him in public, because if they do, they'll be ridiculed. He's so brilliant. And so now they operate in the shadows. They find Judas, who betrays him. This is the thing that absolutely stops them in their tracks. He said to them, then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. The question of if you should pay your tax to Caesar or not is actually quite a simple question to answer. It's about ownership. And a simple principle should determine that. The principle is, if someone owns something and they want it back, give it to them. That's the principle, Jesus says. If someone owns something and they want it back, give it to them. But I suppose the question then is, well, how do you know if someone has a legitimate claim to something? How do you know if someone owns something? And Jesus says, the answer is really simple. Their image is on it. How do you know that Caesar has a legitimate claim to the denarius? Well, his image is on it. So it's his. So if he requires this from you to build his roads or feed the armies that oppress you, give it back. He has a legitimate claim to it. And the reason that Caesar has a legitimate claim from it is actually because his authority comes from God. So that's what Jesus will say to Pilate in his trial. And if you read Romans, that's what Romans says. The authorities that we submit to, they are put above us by God. And the only reason that a Roman emperor is in charge of Israel is because God has given him that authority. So pay your taxes. And this means that Jesus' kingdom, the kingdom that we've been learning about in Luke, isn't in conflict with Caesar's kingdom. It's like he's saying to Simon the Zealot, you don't need to worry about Caesar, Simon. You don't need to worry about passing judgment on Caesar and how he leads his empire. Leave that to God. God will do that. You worry about paying your tax and submitting to the authority that God's put above you. But here's the really remarkable bit, is that he goes further than that, doesn't he? He doesn't just say, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He says, give to God what is God's. Well, okay, we do the same test. How do you know what is God's? How do you know what belongs to God and what he has a legitimate claim to? Oh, it's easy. His image is on it. It's the thing that bears his image, the thing that's made in his image. Namely, you. That is the fundamental defining statement about humanity in the Bible. We are made in God's image. And so Jesus says, yeah, give Caesar the thing that has his image on it, fine. And give God the thing that has his image on it. You. All that you are, all that you have, all your gifts and capacities and resources. It's as if Jesus is saying to Simon the Zealot, Simon, don't worry about Caesar's throne. That is a small thing. Jesus is saying, I'm not here to sit on Caesar's throne. Jesus is saying, I'm here to take the throne of every human heart. Jesus wants surrender from every heart in every kingdom. And this is why the people are absolutely amazed at him. Because in his answer to the trap, he says the only thing that would satisfy both sides of the argument and expand their vision of what the Messiah was here to do. Okay, what does that mean for us? We don't live under Caesar. Well, I think the first application for us is pretty simple, and that is that we should pay our taxes. We should obey the law. We should respect the authorities that God has put over us. And as I say, this is a theme through the Bible. We should submit to authorities because that leads to peace. That leads to a peaceful society. Not always. There are some circumstances that would mean we shouldn't obey the authorities placed over us. But it's pretty rare. And I think basically it's only when the command or the law of the authorities goes directly against God's law in such a way that we cannot obey God's law if we follow their law. So Daniel would be an example that springs to mind of someone who sort of, carries out civil disobedience and is blessed by God for it. But that's the exception, not the rule. So pay your taxes. The second application, I think, for us today is this. Give to God what is God's. Jesus is calling us to a radical life. Following Jesus is very radical because he's not interested in a sort of compartmentalized Christianity. Jesus isn't interested in just Sunday morning and then the rest of the week is ours and we can do with it what we will, apart from small group and prayer meeting. Jesus isn't interested in that type of Christianity. Even though we long for comfort and we long for our space and our time, where we say, oh yeah, I'll do this thing for Jesus, but actually the rest of the week is mine. Jesus says, no. Being part of my kingdom means total surrender, living entirely for Jesus every day. Jesus' tax rate is 100%. Now, for some of us, we have been given incredible resources and capacities and gifts. And Jesus is calling you, if that's you, to devote those to him. And that might mean giving tens of thousands of pounds a week to Christian causes. And there are people like that in our church families. I think of an example of someone that was in need financially in the church, and it was a pretty serious need. It wasn't a small amount of money, and member of the church just said to them, "Oh, I'll give it to you. No questions asked. We'll give it to you. How much do you need? We've saved up in case of an eventuality like this where someone in church was in need and we can help them." And that's a remarkable thing to witness, that kind of generosity and that kind of sacrifice. That wasn't a crazy rich family. That was a family that could have really used the money on a holiday. But they'd saved it up and set it aside in case of someone in need. Because they had made Jesus Lord of their bank account. They had surrendered that part of their life to Jesus. But the call is not just for the wealthy who have lots of resources and lots of capacities. Luke, in a few weeks' time, we're going to get to the sort of end of this small section, and the ultimate example of this that Jesus gives us is a widow who has 2 pennies. She has basically nothing. And the nothing that she has, the tiny, tiny amount that she has, she gives those to the Lord. And Jesus marks her for all of history as the exemplary giver. Because it's not about the amount. It's not about the amount of resources that we've got. It's everything. He wants everything. Total surrender in every part of our lives. But it's not just resources and money, it's relationships. And I've seen it in our church with the people who've given up the prospect of a relationship that their family and their people outside church have said, "You should do this." Their friends have encouraged them into relationships. And they've said, no. I know you think that would make me happy. But my relationships, my romantic life, all of that, I have surrendered to Jesus. So no, I won't pursue that relationship, even though you think it will make me happy. That's a hard conversation to have with your family. But that's what they did, because they had surrendered that part of their life to Jesus. We see it in the people in our church family who do really inconvenient things for Jesus. So I think of a guy who doesn't have the internet on his phone. He doesn't have an internet browser on his phone or any social media apps. His phone is just email and maps and things. And if he wants to download an app, he has to get his wife to put in a password that he doesn't know in the app store, like a parental password, so that he can install that, whatever that app might be. Because so committed to Jesus, so committed to obeying Jesus' sexual ethic is he, that he wants to remove all temptation, and so he surrendered his phone to Jesus. Now, that is inconvenient. Imagine the conversation when your colleague is like, "Oh, let me show you something on YouTube, give me your phone," and you're like, "Oh, no, actually, I don't have YouTube on my phone." "Oh, that's fine, we can download it." "Oh, no, I can't, I need my wife to download apps." That is inconvenient to have that conversation, but it doesn't matter, because he's surrendered to Jesus, that part of his life. Some of us might hear this, and we're just thinking, well, I don't know what to do with this, because in the providence of God, some of us are in a place where it feels like we have no resources and have no capacities, because we're in the midst of a desperate trial. And it feels like any resources that we did have been stripped from us, or the people that we had around us have been taken from us. And so it feels like, well, I don't have anything to give to Jesus. I don't have any resources to give to him. And for those of us in that situation, Jesus calls you to surrender that trial to him. Jesus calls you to make him Lord and King over that trial too. And live in such a way in the midst of that trial, in the midst of that suffering, that brings King Jesus honor and glory. Be devoted to him and surrendered to him, Don't let go of him. Live in such a way that you can say with the psalmist, whom have I in heaven but you? And on earth there is nothing I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart and my family and my mental health and my financial situation may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. That is total devotion to King Jesus, isn't it, in the midst of trial? And that is the devotion that the Lord is calling all of us to. If you're not a Christian today, that is the devotion, the surrender that Jesus is calling you to. He owns you. His image is on you, and he's calling you to surrender because he wants you back. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, thank you for your Son. Thank you that in him we see you, that he is the perfect representation of you, your nature. And thank you for these words that he gave us. Lord, please change us and shape us. Would we surrender all of ourselves, every part of our life, to you, live in obedience to you and your law. Lord, I pray that for everyone in this room. I pray that especially for the people who are in the midst of trial and feel like they have nothing to give. Lord, would you be at work in them? For the people who don't know you, would you be at work in them? That you would be honored and glorified by our lives. Amen.